Hey, it's Danny from ProjectManaverse.com, and in this video I'm going to share 5 pro tips when it comes to managing your project governance. So let's jump straight in. First of all, what is project governance? Project governance is part and parcel of any project using traditional project management methodologies. It's basically your company's policies, procedures, rules about doing projects. So there'll be certain deliverables that you need to meet, certain checklists that you need to fill out, certain approvals that you'll need to get, certain hoops you need to jump through, and that all comes under your project governance. And sometimes it's known as red tape. You've probably heard that expression, there's too much red tape. But that's what project governance is, and there's no escaping it. It needs to be done. It can be a bit of a pain, it can be a chore, it can be tedious and boring, but ultimately the project governance is there to protect, number one, the organization, to make sure the project doesn't do anything stupid that will embarrass the organization or lose the organization a lot of money. It's there to protect the customers. So whatever your project is doing, there's going to be some kind of customer on the receiving end of that project. The governance is there to protect those customers, and the project governance is also there to protect their project manager as well, because if you follow all the project governance, then you can't really mess up. You can't really be blamed for losing £1 million or doing a change that resulted in a really bad impact or breach of law. If you follow the governance, you're going to be protected as a project manager. So it is a good thing. And once you get used to it, you actually come to, I wouldn't say come to like it, but you come to respect it, and you do come to rely on it. So that's what project governance is. It needs to be done, and governance can be very painful, or it can be not too bad. So I wouldn't say it can be easy. It's always a bit of a pain, but it's always a bit of a chore rather, but you can do things to make sure that you're doing it correctly and you're not caught out, because governance can catch you out. Governance has the power to stop your project dead in its tracks. It has the power to stop you from going live with your project. So it can really disrupt your project if you're not on top of it. So I'm going to share some tips to help you navigate your project governance and make sure you're doing it correctly and you're using it to your advantage, and it's not a blocker or an obstacle to you. So pro tip number 1 for project governance is you want to identify all the governance that you need to do as early as possible in the project. So there'll be various forums, there'll be various checklists, there'll be various systems that you need to use, and you need to identify what they are as soon as possible. It might not all be in one place. You might have various different governance forums or different policies that you need to navigate to get your project over the line and to go through all your project phases. So I really recommend identifying all the governance as quickly as possible, and you can do that by looking at other previous projects or talking to other project managers that have done similar projects. You're going to find out what it is, but just do your homework at the start of the project, and then just make sure you're doing it as early as possible and going through it as quickly as you can. You don't want to leave project governance to the last minute, because that's when it really catches you out, and you can stumble at the last minute where there was a bit of governance that you needed to do that you might have missed, and that can actually stop you from going live, and you missed your go live date, and that's really, really bad, causes a massive headache. So as soon as you can, identify it all and get it done. Now some governance you can leave till the last minute, but you don't want that. So some things you just have to do, say, a week before go live, but don't leave it to the last minute. Please trust me, don't do that. Do it as early as you can. Get it in your project plan. And that leads me on to my second pro tip for project governance. You should treat it like any other deliverable on your project and track it carefully. If you've got a list of things you need to do, get that into a tracker and then put a deadline for each one, and then rag each activity. Give it a rag status, so a red status, amber status, or green status, and have a little commentary box as well. That's what I do. I try and get all my governance into one spreadsheet, one place, so it's all there. I've got all the deadlines in there, and I rag it, and I do it with color, so I can just look at that checklist. I usually have a weekly call to run through that checklist, and I can just focus on all the red and the amber items and make sure they're moving on. I've got commentary to see what the next piece of work is or the next action step is. That's a key thing when you're managing these deliverables and these governance things. There's often obstacles and blockers, but you always want to know what is the next step to get that thing moving, to get it ultimately achieved. What's the next step? And that should be in your comment section. You don't want anything just stalled and stopped. You make sure you've always got a next step, and you can manage that, and you can follow it up, and you can chase it up. So that's my pro tip number 2. Treat your governance like any other project deliverable. Pro tip number 3 is to use common sense and challenge where appropriate. Now, governance is, as I say, it's put there to ultimately protect the customer, the project, and you as a project manager and the organization. But sometimes you can't create governance for each specific project. You can't tailor make governance to each project because that would just take forever. There has to be general policies that each project has to adhere to. Even if the project doesn't exactly fit into that, you still have to follow it. And sometimes you have a certain rule to follow or a certain approval to meet or a certain deliverable that needs to be done or a certain IT test that needs to be done, which you'll think this just seems like massive overkill for what I'm trying to do with my project. And often it will be. So don't be afraid to challenge that governance where it's appropriate and actually have a voice and speak to the governing body or whoever the rep is, have a conversation with them and say, look, here's what my project is doing. This doesn't seem like it's serving its purpose. It seems like we're going a bit crazy with this governance. We're going overboard. Can I please just have a waiver or just push back? And you'll learn with time that you do have power as a project manager to do this. It's not always set in stone with the governance. You can actually negotiate, you can push back, and you can always escalate if needs to. If you really think, if you feel strongly about it and you think you're right, then you can go up to your project sponsor and say, look, we're being asked to do this. It's ridiculous. Here's what I think we should be doing. Can you give me some help? And they should be able to help you remove that blocker or help you to negotiate a good outcome for everyone on that particular piece of governance. So that's pro tip number 3, use your common sense and challenge where appropriate. Pro tip number 4 is to make sure you are getting approval for all your key documents on your project. So any IT project will have a bunch of deliverables, documentation that needs to be done, things like your design document, your requirements document, your test plans, your build plans, your configuration documents. All those key documents, they need approval by certain stakeholders. And don't get sloppy with your approvals, because that can sometimes happen. Because if you get sloppy with approvals and documents don't get signed off, you end up in a position where you built a product that doesn't work correctly and you've got no traceability to cover your own back and say, look, we all agree to this design, or we all agree to these requirements, or we all agree to this testing scope, so it's too late to start crying about it now. You need to make sure you're covering the project, covering yourself, getting approvals for all those key documents as you're going along. So first of all, you need to identify the correct stakeholders that need to approve those documents. So make sure you're looking out across your IT landscape, all the teams involved, and have a little session at the start of the project, maybe part of your project kickoff session, to identify those key stakeholders, then get a bit of a matrix together in terms of all your documents and who needs to sign off those documents, who needs to approve them, and make sure you're doing that and you're really strict with yourself and you're making sure you're getting all those sign-offs by email or by a Confluence page or a SharePoint, however you want to do it. Just make sure you get your sign-offs. And if you have some, and on the subject of sign-offs and approvals, doesn't have to be for a document, but when you need to go to an approval body or an approval forum to get a decision made and approval, sometimes it's best to, or not sometimes, it's always best to, if you can, have the one-to-one conversations with those decision makers ahead of the call to get their approval ahead of the call, to warm them up in terms of what they're doing so it's not a surprise. So when that actual meeting happens, it's almost a formality and it's a rubber stamp approval because they've already approved it. You've spoken to them and they know exactly what you're talking about. They know exactly what it is you're doing, what the impacts are, what the risks are, and they have comfort they are going to approve that thing ahead of that call. So that's what you need to do with any kind of key approval board or decision-making forum or meeting. Make sure you're trying to get the approvals offline ahead of that meeting. So when you go into it, it's more of a formality and you're just doing it for the audit trail and the record of the meeting, and you've got the formal approvals via email after the meeting. So that's pro tip number 4, is approval documents, and make sure you identify the stakeholders at the start of your project. Okay, last pro tip when it comes to your project governance is be diligent and disciplined with your configuration management and traceability. What is configuration management? Configuration management can be applied to your actual build, but it can also be applied to the documentation. So documentations, when you write a document, let's say you're writing a requirements document, you're going to have the first draft version, and you could call it, let's say, version 0.1. So every time you then change that document or you make some kind of amends that fall into a threshold criteria, you want to update the version of that document and put it up to 0.2, 0.3, keep going up. And ideally, when you've got the final approved version, that's your version 1.0. Then after that, if you've got CRs or change requests that change the requirements after that, you might have version 1.2 or 1.3 or whatever. You can keep going with it. But you want to make sure you're very on the ball with your configuration management of all your documents. Number one, make sure all your documents are stored in one place, a central depository. And number two, make sure all the versioning is up to date. If you're making changes to the document, track those changes on a summary page so you can see what changes have been made. So you can look back at the history of the document, all the changes that have been made, and all the subsequent approvals that have been made to approve those changes. That's your configuration documentation or configuration management of documentation. The other thing I said was traceability. So you want to make sure that all your documents are traceable to each other. So you always start off with a high level, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, let's say requirements document. So you've got your requirements document, all your requirements are listed there. Then usually you have your design document, then you have your test scope, and then your build. And what you want to do is make sure that everything is traced to each other. So your requirements document is traced to your design. So if you've got an element of design, you can trace that back to a initial requirement. If you've actually got something you're testing, your test plan, you can trace that back to part of the design, and you can trace that part of the design back to an initial requirement. So you've got traceability throughout the entire project of all your documentation. That's a really good discipline to get into. Make sure you're doing it. These things are very easy to slip and let go of and get a bit sloppy with, because projects are so busy, you've got so much going on, you're always firefighting. But if you can get on top of this and make sure you're disciplined with it, it makes your life so much easier in the long run. Life is easy if you live it the hard way, and life is very hard if you live it the easy way. So make your life hard and be disciplined with your configuration management and traceability. Okay, I'm over time there. Going to wrap up the video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. If you want to see more videos like this one, hit that subscribe button. I'm doing daily videos. And until tomorrow, please take care.